The warden snapped the ledger shut and said, "No one lies down. No one sleeps." The words landed like a weight across the barracks. Prisoners who had been swaying on tired feet straightened. The survivor felt a stab of betrayal when he heard the warden name the law as something more than discipline. Betrayal hardened his jaw and pushed him to watch rather than sink. The warden read the decree aloud, voice low and final, and a guard struck the brass keyring against his palm to punctuate each clause. That single instant, command, brass, watchful circle, began the night's procedure. By the second sentence, the central problem was visible. Sleep, the body's uncontrollable surrender, had become a punishable offense. The narrator recorded the decree's headline in the ledger while the warden paced. The warden's boots tapped a steady count. Guards arranged themselves like brackets around the rows of standing bodies. The survivor had not been singled out by name at roll call, but his face had been watched all the same. He kept his shoulders squared and his fingers open against his thighs so that falling unconscious would not look accidental. The scene showed a clear conflict. An administrative order converted a human need into an instrument of control, and the survivor had to choose how to endure. The barracks smelled of sweat and tallow. Torches guttered against cold draft points in the rafters. Prisoners blinked until their eyes stung. The warden listed the penalties for non-compliance and finished with a measured phrase. Those who failed would be recorded as recalcitrant and removed. Recorded, the warden, not treated. Someone in the back of the row coughed and a guard turned and jabbed the man's elbow with a baton. "Stand," the guard barked. "Petrov, hold his head up." That command produced the first small argument of the night. "Petrov," the survivor hissed under his breath, keeping his tone low so a guard might not hear. "You have to keep your head. Don't let them write you down." Petrov's jaw worked. "I will not be their note," Petrov whispered. The survivor's hand found the thin blanket looped at his waist and tightened. Suspicion moved through the row. Eyes shifted to one another. The wound of betrayal widened. Men realized the law was not aimed at misbehavior alone, but at some selection unseen in the brass keyring's glint. After roll call, the warden stepped into the corridor and briefed his captains. "Names on the list get special attention tonight," he said, tapping a folded paper with a blunt finger. The guards accepted brass keys and batons without surprise. The warden spoke about order and the necessity of maintaining labor output. He described methods in precise terms. Jolt patrols every hour. Force movement. If a head dips, strike the shoulder. If a body fails, haul him out. The warden's voice lacked heat. It offered logistics and a timetable. The men in the corridor left with leather gloves and an efficiency that smelled of oil and old smoke. The survivor watched the exchange from the back of the barracks when a guard passed by and brushed his sleeve. The guard did not speak to him, but the survivor read names in the guard's softened expression. That guarded glance became another small revelation. The law was a tool serving a larger purge. The survivor felt the first shift change inside him, cold calculation replacing stunned betrayal. He began planning small evasions. How to keep his knees locked, how to angle his shoulders so a baton strike would not topple him. He started to measure his breathing in discrete counts, a mechanical defense against surrender. Patrols began before midnight had given way to dawn. Guards moved through the yard and ordered groups to haul heavy stones and roll barrels. The work was familiar. What changed was the instruction that the work not cease for rest, move. A guard screamed, "Keep the wheel turning." The survivor's legs shook after the first hour. He blinked until letters danced at the edges of his vision. A guard caught the motion and shoved him forward with a leather, gloved hand. "Wake up, Torres," the guard said. "We marked you for watching." The name landed like a physical hit. The survivor met the guard's eyes and held them. He forced words out. "Why me, Torres?" he said. "Why mark me?" The guard's mouth hardened. "It's not my list." Torres replied, "The paper comes from above." The survivor felt his suspicion deepen into fear. He thought of times he had argued with a local magistrate 2 months prior. He pictured that magistrate's paper seal and a private meeting he had not realized would become a sentence. In the yard, someone fell into the dirt. Guards dragged him up by the collar and shoved him back into the line. The survivor saw the small red welt on a guard's wrist, where a rope had once cut skin, marks of previous enforcement. Each visible scar explained an enforcement style: practical, unsentimental, procedural. A slump in the line produced its first medical casualty. A man named Alvarez folded against a low wall and lay still. Guards pried his fingers open, record him as non-compliant. A guard said, "We do not treat these cases here." The warden walked over, paused, and wrote a single word in the ledger. The survivor moved a fraction closer, fingers rubbing the coarse weave of his tunic. He wanted to step forward to help. He did not. He could not risk the guard's attention and the warden's scrawl on the ledger. Instead, he watched Alvarez carried toward the removal gate, watched the way other men turned their faces away when the body passed. That avoidance changed a private anger into a clearer resolve. He had to keep himself upright for other people's sake, because falling meant erasure. In a narrow supply corridor, a tired guard sidled up to the survivor and spoke without the usual bark. "They marked 3 men last month," the guard said. "They wanted troublemakers broken first." The note had names. The guard's voice dropped. "You were on one of those lists, survivor. Not because you did wrong, but because you annoyed the wrong man in a meeting." The survivor's mouth went dry. This admission shifted his emotional center again. Betrayal had become targeted fear, then a brittle clarity. He felt rage at the unnamed authority and fear for what the list could mean for others. He moved his hand to the threadbare blanket that was his signature item, fingers counting the frayed loop as if it were a talisman. He tried to organize resistance. The survivor whispered to a neighbor in the dormitory row and passed along the idea to hide a blanket to share during the bleak hours. "Hide one blanket," he said quietly. "When the guard turns, we pass it under 3 sets of feet, and one will sleep for 5 minutes. 5 minutes is enough to clear the head." The neighbor, Marin, muttered agreement and nodded. Other prisoners listened and mouthed the numbers. They made a plan that relied on small timing and quiet signals. The plan was a thin, practical refusal that took only shared breaths and the courage to risk being noted. They tried and failed. A guard named Ferris saw the blanket move and shouted, "Torres, stop them!" Ferris called. They tried to hide comfort. The exchange escalated into an interrogation. "Who gave you that blanket?" Ferris demanded. "Who is organizing?" The survivor felt him press his knuckles to the scaffold of his own chest to keep his breath even. He answered in clipped sentences. "No one gave it. We found it. We were cold." Ferris narrowed his eyes. "You think that's enough? Names. I want names." The back and forth lasted 3 rapid exchanges. Ferris demanded. Marin denied. The survivor stepped between them and said, "We keep our heads up." The guard slapped the survivor's face once, then twice. The sound cut across the row like an alarm. After the slap, the warden ordered a private interrogation. The survivor was dragged into a small utility room with only one guttering candle. The warden placed his brass keyring on the table and looked at the survivor without raising his voice. "Tell me names," the warden. "Tell me who coddles traitors." The survivor's mouth tasted of iron. He measured his words. He did not believe the warden would spare a man for truth. He believed the warden wanted to divide them, to force betrayal from exhaustion. The survivor kept quiet. He felt an inward tremor that was part anger and part exhaustion. The emotional shift moved him from fear to a desperate steadiness. He refused to name anyone. The warden's jaw tightened. He smiled once, thinly, and reached for the ledger. Guards increased the patrols after the failed ruse. They timed the work with whistles and short bursts of forced marching. The survivor's knees began to tremble between orders. He kept locking his knees and flexing muscles to stave off collapse. He counted again. The counting changed. 3 strike the drum, 7 steps, 10 breaths, repeat. At one point the survivor's head dipped and a guard struck his shoulder with a baton. "Up." The guard said, "Torres, watch him." The survivor swallowed and forced his eyes open. He heard himself speaking without intending to. "I am awake. I am awake." The declaration became a small theater of resistance that other men echoed automatically to prove compliance. Dawn approached in a thin gray. Many men moved like men made of cloth, folding and unfolding themselves with every order. Then the warden did what the survivor had feared. He dragged the survivor from a near collapse in front of the assembled barracks and demanded names. The warden's voice cut. "Name the instigators," he said. "Name them or be recorded." The survivor's knees shook, and he clung to the edge of the plank stage. The warden prodded him with the baton. "You speak." The survivor tried to steady his breath. He looked at faces in the crowd, Petrov, Marin, Alvarez, empty place on the bench, and he measured the cost of words. His decision point was immediate and public. The crowd quieted into a sharp, watchful stillness. The warden pressed Torres, who planned the blanket, who counseled the others to feign wakefulness. The survivor answered with a single short line. "I will not betray them." The warden struck the baton across the stage rail in 3 hard knocks. Guards grabbed the survivor's arms, and he felt the rope read into his wrists, then collapse. The warden, "We will mark your record accordingly." The survivor's eyes flicked to the ledger held open by a guard near the infirmary. He saw a column labeled compliant and another labeled non-compliant. The warden wrote a note in the latter column and snapped the book closed. The strike of the pen was a sound like finality. They hauled him off the stage and into the infirmary. The narrator moved through the room with gloves and a pocket watch, checking pulse, noting bruises. He recorded facts in a voice that did not rise or fall beyond the necessary cadence. Torres, 28 years, pronounced alive, extreme exhaustion, refusal to comply listed. Kept for observation. The survivor lay on a narrow cot and watched the narrator write. He felt his anger change again, this time into a worn, cold determination to survive long enough to testify. He, in a low whisper to the narrator, "Write everything. Write the names you heard, write the methods. Let it be on paper." The narrator paused, set the pen down, and then continued writing a longer entry than usual. The ledger marked the night as compliant for most and non-compliant for a few. The warden's report framed the removals as policy enforcement. The survivor sat with his wrists ringed in faint rope scars and listened as the narrator catalogued injuries with clinical words. The narrator's voice kept to the facts, what was visible, what was recorded, and refused to moralize. That refusal served as a buffer for the survivor. Though the narrator remained detached, his record keeping meant a chance that the night's brutality would not be fully erased. Outside the infirmary door, a guard returned the folded paper to the warden's hands with his own handwriting on the edge, 3 names circled. The warden glanced at the page and folded it back into his coat. The survivor felt a cold certainty. The law was not blind. It concentrated on particular targets to remove dissent or settle scores. The final act of the chapter was small and physical. The narrator closed the ledger with a decisive motion and clipped the brass watch chain to its edge. He plainly, "I will preserve this entry." The survivor looked at the ledger, at the brass chain, then at the narrow window where morning light cut a pale bar across the floor. The night had ended in restraint rather than resolution. Men stood or were carried out. Names were written. The survivor's body would heal in part, but he would keep the imprint of the rope on his wrists and the H of enforced wakefulness in his bones. He had not given names, he had been listed. The narrator's final recorded line for the chapter read like a verdict. The law had been applied, human cost documented. The last sound was the ledger's cover shutting and the warden's boots receding down the corridor. The chapter closed on the concrete action of the ledger being locked and the survivor gripping his threadbare blanket, a physical promise to remember the exact details of that night. He went to his knees and the yard swallowed the sound of his skull against stone. The warden barked, "Pick him up," and a guard shoved the man's shoulders until he staggered upright. Betrayal tightened the survivor's jaw as he watched the warden pass down the line with the ledger tucked under his arm. The law outlawed sleep. That was the problem, flat and immediate. And the warden's ledger was the proof that the law was not rumor but design. The yard smelled of iron sweat and horsehair torches. Prisoners kept their eyes on the ground and counted steps to keep from nodding. The narrator reported details without commentary. He recorded the sequence. Midnight parade in the outer exercise yard, a collapse, the warden inspecting the line, a ledger closed with a brass clip, a sentence enforced without mercy. The survivor had been on his feet since before dusk. He had heard the ledger slammed shut the night before and the warden's proclamation. No one lies down. No one sleeps. He carried betrayal as both fact and instrument. That feeling made him keep his feet now, refusing to slump when the world tugged at his eyelids. A patrol guard shoved the fallen man forward. Thomas, a broad, shouldered-in mate who had worked beside the survivor in the laundry, hissed, watch him, and nudged the survivor's elbow. The survivor answered with a tight nod and a grip at his blanket. He had a reason to watch. A small plan held his attention steadier than exhaustion alone. Suspicion moved through him first. Doubt followed. Then a stubborn clarity that he must keep a record by action if the ledger could be stolen. Those 3 shifts, suspicion to fear to deliberate resolve, altered how he held himself under the lamps. They marched until the ground blurred with repetition. Guards thudded down the line like a metronome. The warden walked with his shoulders forward, brass keys at his hip. He stopped to look at each face, tapping a finger against the ledger's cover, and his mouth formed a line that meant both instruction and threat. No breaks. No nodding. The warden, keep them moving. The survivor tasted copper and the memory of the ledger from the inspection hall. He remembered the ledger's margin marks from the night before, coded symbols that mapped punishment to behavior. He had seen guard Lena trace one mark with her finger and then look away. The midnight collapse became a hook that changed more than one man's night. The warden ordered the fallen man dragged back to his feet, and the crowd watched the man stumble, hand pressed to a split lip. The warden's voice cut through the yard. Send him to the infirmary list at dawn, and mark him for the next watch. The survivor felt the ledger shift under his mind like a physical weight. He could not yet reach it, but he could watch the movements around it. He catalogued them. Who touched the ledger, how the record keeper wrote in cramped, mechanical strokes, who paused with a finger over the margin. By late evening the scene shifted indoors to the central inspection hall. The warden stood under a single iron lamp and ordered a formal redistribution of duties. The record keeper read aloud names from the ledger, while the head guard checked the list against the watch roster. The survivor stood in the back with Thomas and heard his name called for the wake shift. His heart tightened. He answered with the cracked sound of his own voice. The survivor, he said, so the record keeper would mark him down. The warden nodded once and tapped the ledger. Stand watch. Do not sleep. The words landed like a verdict. Conversation there revealed structure and stakes. The record keeper's voice was small and quick. You will be on the east walk. The record keeper, stand the first watch. If you falter, you will be listed. The head guard added, anyone marked twice moves to labor exhaustion next week. Thomas muttered, they will break you for us all. The survivor answered with a ground, level plan and no flourish. I will keep notes. I will make proof. That statement did not sound like hope. It sounded like logistics. It shifted the survivor from passive endurance to a precise objective. Preparations for the wake shift narrowed the world to corridors and doors. The head guard escorted the survivor past iron, shelved supplies and the Sally port, where a thin winter wind bit through cracks. Thomas leaned in. Don't close your eyes, not for a blink. Keep a rhythm with your feet. Count the lamp posts and the knots in the rail. If you drop a step, I will smack you back upright. Thomas's speech was blunt and functional. It contained both warning and an offer of shared risk. The survivor matched Thomas' cadence. His motivation moved from private survival to preserving evidence. Guard Lena had shown hesitation when she touched the ledger's margin. That hesitation became an opening. When the survivor took his post beneath the low lamps of the interior barrack walkways, the first hours were a mechanical ritual. A bell system marked each hour with a steady clang. Patrols moved in practiced sweeps. The survivor forced his jaw unclenched and measured each breath. At times his eyes closed for a sliver of a second, and he felt the floor tip. Each sleep threatened to become a collapse. A patrol guard caught his shoulder mid, sway and shoved him forward. Keep moving. the patrol guard said, voice low. He shoved the survivor's elbow with the flat of his hand. The survivor's chest tightened and his fingers trembled. He counted steps silently, then changed the count to letters. When the patrol passed, he mouthed the letters to himself as if they were a rosary. The record keeper walked the passage twice that night with a lantern, pencil wavering over the ledger. Each pass raised the survivor's fear and sharpened his focus. During a lull, the survivor shuffled past the record table and glimpsed the ledger open. The coded marginalia lay across the corner of a written column, tiny, angled marks that mapped severity to someone's name. Guard Lena stood with her back to him, tracing a mark with a finger. She hesitated, then pressed her thumb against the paper as though to smudge a word. The survivor's suspicion flared into a quick hope. Guard Lena's hesitation was proof that not everyone obeyed without thought. He felt the need to act then. He Thomas in a soft aside. Lena touched the margin. She knows. Thomas' eyes narrowed. Do you mean to take a page, Thomas? The survivor answered, I mean to get evidence. If I can show this ledger, we can name the method. The two men argued in hushed sentences. 3 rapid exchanges about timing, watch rotations, and who would keep lookout. The argument ended with Thomas cutting in. At dawn, when the head guard moves the roster, I'll make the noise by the water cistern. You slip into the alcove, the plan formed with the sharp efficiency of men used to small, risky tasks. The early morning hours became a sequence of brief, brutal tests. The bell whose clang had once been a marker now served as punishment. Each peal summoned an extra sweep. The survivor dodged patrols and kept time with a seam in the floorboards. At one point, a patrol slanted through the record keeper's shadow against the ledger, and the silhouette made the marginalia look larger and more purposeful. The survivor felt fear rise, his hands slick, his breath shallow, but he steadied by imagining a single, concrete result, a torn page in his blanket. The theft attempt took place behind the inspection hall in the archive alcove just before the pre-dawn shift change. Guard Lena and the survivor moved as planned. Thomas had created a diversion at the water cistern. Head guard and a pair of patrols had gone to investigate the commotion. The survivor slipped into the alcove and drew the ledger out with a trembling hand. The paper smelled of dust and ink. He peeled a single page at the corner and folded it into his palm. A nail scraped the stone. The record keeper's steps returned sooner than expected. The survivor froze, his fingers bent around the folded paper. Lena stepped forward and offered a quiet command. Move. Now, the survivor obeyed. In 3 quick, whispered exchanges they almost had the page free and almost had the ledger closed without notice. Then a shadow fell across the doorway. The head guard had returned early. The alcove turned into a narrow fight for silence. The record keeper's breath was audible. The survivor felt heartbeat against his ribs. Lena shoved the folded piece deeper into the survivor's blanket, while the survivor banged his elbow on a shelf to simulate falling. The head guard entered and spoke to the record keeper in clipped tones. The men played their parts. The head guard's suspicion sharpened. He moved closer to the ledger, leaned in to check a line, and then stepped away with a small mutter. The head's walk left a space for them to breathe, but the near discovery became a mid-chapter cliffhanger. For a moment the survivor thought he would be caught by the head guard, and the night's entire plan would collapse. They escaped with only a bruise and a warning in the ledger's spine. The head guard had marked nothing, but the warden noticed irregularity by dawn. The warden's scrutiny intensified. He ordered a public roll call in the yard and an immediate redistribution of duties. Standing before the assembled prisoners, the warden named names and pointed to those who would stand watch. He set the survivor in the center. The warden's voice rose until the yard held its breath. Let this be the example, he said, and his baton flashed in the torchlight. You will learn that rest is a privilege you no longer possess. When the survivor was singled out, the crowd's energy shifted. Thomas pushed from the line and called the survivor's name with a voice raw from hours of standing. The head guard advanced with the brass keyring catching the light. Guards formed a ring. The warden spoke to the assembled prisoners in even tones that masked the hunger behind his command. The punishment was necessary. The law required proof of obedience. The survivor felt humiliation as his body resisted upright posture, his knees threatened to give way, and he held himself with a refusal that became a kind of statement. He answered the warden's command with a voice that would not break. "I will stand." The warden's hand landed on a baton, and he tapped it against his palm. The punishment that followed was physical and deliberate. The guards forced the survivor to pace in place, then to perform slow squats while a rope looped around his wrists to keep him upright. The crowd watched every motion. The warden ordered a demonstration. A man must show strength to resist sleep. The survivor's legs shook, his teeth ground. He mumbled a sequence of letters under his breath to keep the mind alert. A guard struck the back of his calf when his shoulder drooped. The motion of the baton against bone and the scrape of rope on skin replaced any abstract description of suffering. Details like these showed the work of the law. At the peak moment, the survivor's knees buckled, and he collapsed forward. The yard filled with the raw sound of bodies reacting. The warden signaled, and 2 guards hauled the survivor upright by his arms. The warden demanded that he look at the ledger that had been set on a low stand for all to see. The record keeper pointed with his pen. The ledger's page showed lines of names and coded marks, ashes where an eye had been gouged from a previous rounding off. A column listing the extra labor assigned to those who failed the watch. The warden's voice arrived like a verdict. "This is law. This is order." The survivor's body trembled. The wordless shame and the physical breaking played out under the lamps. The survivor's emotional chain moved again, from defiance to humiliation to a raw, steady clarity. He had to preserve what he had stolen. After the public punishment, the yard dispersed into ritual cleansing. Guards moved prisoners back to their bunks for a dawn rinse and a bread ration. The warden conferred with the head guard near the ledger and edited an entry. He crossed out a line and wrote a softer phrasing that would look less severe in later readings. The record keeper's hand hovered for a moment, then wrote the revised text with the same cramped strokes. The warden's revision was an attempt to shape memory. In the barracks corner where damp straw collected, Guard Lana waited until the warden and head guard turned their backs. She approached the survivor with a look that held both fear and decision. The survivor's voice was a thin rasp when he whispered, "Did you get it?" Guard Lena moved with the slowness of someone who had rehearsed this precise motion. She eased a folded scrap from beneath her sleeve and let it fall into the survivor's blanket. Her fingers left a smudge of ink. The ledger fragment had 3 lines of entries and margin marks. One line named a man who had been taken to the infirmary the previous week. Another listed extra watch duty assigned that day. The third recorded what looked like a code for punitive labor. The survivor pressed the page to his chest. His hands shook but did not let go. The physical act of carrying the torn page changed his posture. He was no longer only a body being kept awake. He had something that could show the ledger system at work. Guard Lena's face was blank for a breath, then she nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The survivor clutched the blanket tight and said, "Thank you." Her lips formed words without sound and she stepped back. The warden's voice came from outside the doorway, rehearsed and controlled. "The record shall stand as law." The survivor felt the ledger's weight and the earliest promise of what the torn page might do. Reveal names, expose routine, and challenge the lie the warden wrote into public record. They left the barracks with the same ritual motions as before, washing bread, the tidy folding of blankets that hid rope marks, but the internal balance had shifted. The survivor's body still trembled. He still flinched at sudden noises, yet his purpose sharpened into a single measurable aim: to keep the ledger page safe until it could be shown to someone who would read it without fear. He imagined a concrete next step. Find a sympathetic scribe in the city, show the page, place it in safe hands. That image, practical, tactical, kept him upright through the final watch. When the warden revised the public entry, the ledger remained a contested object. The warden's edit altered how future eyes would understand the night's events. Guard Lena's smudged thumb proved otherwise. The survivor's final action in this chapter was neither a speech nor a vow. He folded the torn page into an inner seam and pressed it flat against his chest beneath the blanket. The last sound in the barracks was the scrape of straw as men moved to clean themselves. Guard Lena slid back into the shadows. Survivor breathed shallowly, counting the lamp ties on his wrist until the dawn brightened the slits of the window, and then he felt a quiet, small weight against his ribs. The ledger fragment tucked into his blanket, and the knowledge that a record of the law now rode with him into the next watch. A guard shoved the collapsed body through the warden's office door and slammed it down on the rough wooden floor. The warden did not step forward. He watched the man's chest hit the boards and said, without surprise, "Keep him breathing." Betrayal rose in the survivor like acid. He had heard the ledger's rules announced before, but seeing a body carried like a broken tool made the law a thing that took flesh. The survivor moved closer until a guard shoved him back, and the warden held his ledger under his arm as if it were a map of right conduct. The scene began with the raw, immediate problem. A man had collapsed from enforced wakefulness, and the ledger that ordered the wake was in the warden's hands. Within those minutes, the survivor decided to act because betrayal drove him. He remembered how the warden had snapped the ledger shut months earlier, how that sound had landed across the barracks and turned tired men into rigid figures. He had seen the warden close the book and name the law in a voice meant to seal obedience. Now, when the book had ordered a body to be delivered like refuse, betrayal guided his choices. The stakes were simple and visible. The ledger named who must be kept awake, and those names sometimes never left the parade ground alive. The private office smelled of oiled leather and candle smoke. A guard knelt to check the collapsed man's pulse, and the warden folded the ledger against his hip. The survivor watched the guard peel back the tunic and saw a folded scrap of paper tucked at the man's waist. The survivor's hands tightened. He could have turned away and left the folded page to the warden, but betrayal kept him moving. He stepped forward, fingers grazing the inlaid brass of the warden's pocket watch, and then a second guard stepped between them. Who is he? The survivor, prisoner 912, the guard said, dropped in the yard at 2 hours past midnight. The guard's voice was clipped. His eyes avoided the warden. Bring him to the infirmary, the warden ordered. He did not look at the survivor. The guard lifted the collapsed man onto a cart, and another guard followed with a lantern. The survivor trod behind them, close enough to hear the whisper of the folded page inside the man's tunic. The survivor's doubt, did the ledger intentionally pick men to be singled out, shifted into suspicion as he imagined names crossed and uncrossed like orders. This was the first emotional shift, betrayal to suspicion. In the makeshift infirmary, the medic stripped the man's clothing and set him on a narrow pallet under a weak candle. The survivor knelt to see the page, then reached and withdrew it. It was a single leaf, its edge chewed by damp, with handwriting in a clerk's small, tight hand. The survivor kept the page folded in his palm until the medic looked up. "What's that?" The medic asked. "Nothing." The survivor lied. His pulse rocketed. The fear that another man might be sacrificed by paper made his fingers go cold. He had seen faint markings before, names erased and re-entered, but never a page hidden on a man. The page implied selection, not accident. The survivor folded his jaw and slipped the paper into his tunic. He left the infirmary claiming to fetch a straw mattress and slipped down a corridor where the night still tasted of smoke. He moved through half-light, hands in his sleeves, listening for doors and footsteps. He remembered the ledger snapping shut from months earlier and felt the memory flare into action. He had to reach the warden's office and see what other orders the ledger carried. Suspicion turned now to resolve. He would not simply watch more men be carried away. At dawn he crept toward the warden's door. The corridor held the smell of cold stone and the damp hem of sleeping men. 2 patrol guards passed him, one with a lantern, and the survivor flattened himself against the wall. He timed their steps, scanned the latch, and slipped to the warden's threshold. He could hear the faint metallic ring of the warden's keys. A patrol guard rounded the corner as the survivor reached for the handle. The guard's eyes fixed on him with a slow, calculating look. "Stop," the guard said. The survivor planted his feet. "I am only checking the latrines," he said. The guard narrowed his eyes. "The latrines were cleared an hour ago." "Who sent you?" The survivor's hands found the folded page in his tunic. His voice wanted to be steady. "No one." "Let me pass." The guard reached for his baton and the survivor lunged, slamming his shoulder into the man's ribs. They wrestled in the corridor. The guard cursed and the survivor felt the patrol's weight and breath. They exchanged 3 hard blows. The guard's jaw snapped back into place and the survivor's knuckles burned. The corridor filled with noise. A second guard arrived and the survivor knew he had been seen. He shoved the beaten patrol guard into a stairwell and bolted for the warden's door. This was action. The survivor chose risk because betrayal did not let him stand by. He forced the door open a crack and peered in. The warden sat, ledger on his knee, candle guttering beside him. The room smelled like iron. The survivor slipped in and slid along a shelf until his hand closed on the warden's chair back. He could see the ledger's spine, the brass corner protector, the crowded names. At that moment the warden looked up. "What do you think you are doing?" he said. The survivor stepped into the light and produced the folded page. "Where did you get that?" the warden demanded. A guard's voice answered from the door. He forced entry. The warden's face did not change. He set the ledger down slowly as if handling evidence. The survivor opened the folded sheet. It showed a list of names and beside them a single word marked in the clerk's hand. "Wake." Beside some names were short marginal notes. "Hours to maintain." A small cross where a man had been kept until he stopped breathing. The survivor's mouth went dry. He read a name aloud. 912, he said. The warden did not flinch. 912 has been on the roll 3 nights. He collapsed in the yard. "That is what happens when a man does not rest." His voice was a taut wire. "You ordered it." The survivor. "You signed the roll." The warden closed the ledger and pushed it away. "The law is not my invention. The law is a chain we apply. If you question it, you question order." He reached for his baton. "Seize him." Guards moved into the doorway. The survivor slammed the ledger onto the desk, pushed it toward the candle, and forced it open. Names spilled across the page. He grabbed a handful of pages and began to tear. "Read it," he said. The warden barked orders and a guard lunged. The survivor and the guard traded blows. The ledger slipped and a candle tipped. Wax ran over the torn margin. The candlelight reflected off the brass corners. The warden shouted, and the barracks walls seemed to tighten around each command. The survivor's action was blunt and immediate. Tear the ledger in front of everyone. Expose the list. Force the warden to answer. The next emotional shift moved from resolve into anger. His hands trembled with it. He shoved a page into a guard's face and pointed to the names marked for extra hours. "Who signed this?" he demanded. The senior guard hesitated. "Orders come with the ledger," he said. "We carry out the hours listed." "From whom?" The survivor pressed. A low-ranking patrol guard, pale and shaking, stepped forward with his hands raised. He had been present when the ledger was passed each night. "The magistrate sends the ledger," he said. "The warden brings it in. Some nights the clerk adds names. Some nights the ledger is delivered with a list. Sometimes," he stopped, voice breaking, "sometimes a note comes folded into the binding with names circled." Silence fell. The warden's jaw tightened. The survivor felt a small, sharp change inside him. Suspicion hardened into clarity. The ledger was not merely the warden's tool. It arrived from above. This revelation shifted the scale of responsibility. The warden tried to close the book against the light, and one guard blocked him with an outstretched arm, who circled the names. The survivor. The patrol guard swallowed. "I do not know the magistrate's hand. I only carry orders." The survivor grabbed the ledger, forced it open to where a folded page had been taped to the spine, and found another scrap. It contained a seal stamp and a short line of handwriting from an outside hand. The warden's face went pale in the candlelight. The ledger's authority was no longer local. It traced back to a magistrate who sat beyond the prison walls and sent lists to be enforced. Guards surged. The warden barked, "Remove him." The survivor shoved a page into a guard's chest. and the room turned into the sound of cuffs and grunts. The warden's men moved like a trained unit. They had practiced suppression. The survivor took a scrap and held it above his head. "Do you hear them?" "Read this." "Read who signs your orders." His voice sounded raw. A guard shoved him to the floor. Men tumbled and the ledger slipped, pages scattering like torn leaves under a gust. The warden's baton connected with the survivor's ribs. For a moment the survivor saw the candle flame dance. He felt the scrape of wood on his cheek. He wrestled up and threw a chair, buying a second for a guard to tear the paper from his hand. Outside, the barracks filled. Prisoners pressed toward the doorway, eyes like dark wells. The warden stepped to the threshold and raised his hand. He read aloud a passage from the ledger in the same measured voice used months earlier when he had snapped it shut. "Discipline must be maintained. Disturbance will not be tolerated." His words carried weight. They were meant to choke argument. The survivor shouted, "You are reading orders that name men to be kept awake until they cease. The magistrate signs for deaths by exhaustion." The crowd gasped, guards tightened ranks. The warden's face tightened into a mask of control. "The law is order," he repeated. A young patrol guard, one who had once been seen carrying straw to the infirmary, stepped forward with his hands trembling. He had been forced to carry men out at night. "The ledger arrives from the magistrate," he said. "Sometimes a note is folded into it asking that certain men be kept longer. They wrote names on the margins, they wrote hours. They circled them. We followed orders." His voice broke into a whisper. That confession moved the chapter's axis. It was a twist that expanded culpability beyond the prison's walls and changed the survivor's strategy. The survivor had expected to expose the warden. He had not expected the magistrate's hand. This new information shifted his anger into a cold calculation. Expose the ledger's origin and the warden's claim of sole responsibility would crumble. The warden struck a table with his palm. "Enough," he barked. Guards closed in. The survivor forced the ledger back into the center of the barracks and tore it wide with his hands. Names, dates, and notations lay exposed to the candlelight. The guards tried to snatch pages. Prisoners grabbed at loose edges. The ledger began to burn along a corner where wax had dripped and a page curled in the heat. In the struggle, the survivor heard a soft sound, a whisper from an older guard who had kept his distance. "They keep a separate list." The older guard said, "A ledger of nights removed. A hidden roll. I saw it once when the warden was drunk and left it open. They crossed names there. I saw crosses by men I knew." This new revelation hit like a second twist. There was a ledger within the ledger, a hidden roll used for nightly removals. Hands reached and tore. A guard shoved the survivor hard against a pillar and pinned his arms. The survivor spat a word at the warden. "Coward." The warden answered with the same measured voice he used for the ledger, "You endanger everyone. You will be disciplined." He signaled 2 guards to drag the survivor to the post. The crowd shouted, some in fear, others in sudden, quiet fury at the hidden record. At the service stairwell, the survivor forced a confession from an intercepted patrol guard. He pressed his thumb against the man's collar and held the folded page under his nose. "Tell me who signs for the lists," he demanded. The patrol guard's voice came out small. "Sometimes papers arrive sealed with the magistrate's stamp. Sometimes the warden adds names at night. Sometimes an outside officer drops a list in the messenger's bag." I saw a name circled that matched the magistrate's clerk. The guard's eyes dropped to the floor. "They meet to carry orders, nothing else." That forced confession made the ledger's circulation concrete. The survivor felt an emotional shift there. Anger pushed into grim determination. He understood now that proving the ledger's origin would not only expose the warden, but implicate officials beyond the prison walls. Morning muster gathered everyone at the parade ground. The warden stood on a raised platform with the ledger closed at his side. He read obligations aloud in the same steady cadence that had commanded men to their tasks before. The survivor walked to the platform and, with the ledger page folded in his fist, presented it to the gathered crowd. "Read it," he said. "This page proves names are selected and removed. Read it now." His voice carried over the yard. The warden turned red. "You are a troublemaker," he said. "You will be restrained." A senior guard reached for the survivor's arms. The survivor stepped back and unfolded the page, forcing it into the air. He tore another sheet from his tunic and showed both pieces so the sun struck the ink. Several prisoners shouted. The warden barked and the senior guard grabbed the survivor roughly, slamming his shoulder into a post. Silence. The warden shouted, "The law is necessary. The lists are lawful." He cupped the ledger and struck his cane to the ground to impose silence. A guard with a shaken face stepped forward. "We do what the ledger says," he said, "but I saw names circled that were not explained. I carried a man out one night flagged, and he did not stand again." His admission carried like a thrown stone across the yard. The warden's hand twitched. When the survivor tore the ledger open in public, names fluttered across the parade ground. The warden's enforcement turned violent. Guards pushed forward. One guard raised a baton and hit the ledger from the survivor's hands. Pages blew into the dirt. The crowd surged to snatch the fragments. The warden called for calm and then ordered a demonstration of discipline. 2 men were dragged and forced to run laps, without lying down until they fell. After the rush, wounded were tended in the infirmary and several men hid torn pages in the lining of blankets and the seams of clothes. The survivor, bandaged on the arm, watched the warden's ledger reclosed and stacked with other official books. The survivor handed a small scrap to the medic and whispered a name. The medic folded it into his own shirt and nodded. By evening, a small group met in a hidden alcove beneath the infirmary floor. The survivor, the medic, a remorseful patrol guard, and one older prisoner, a man who had once seen the hidden roll, pressed close around a gutted candle. They counted names, compared notes, and hid torn pages between floorboards. The survivor traced a name with a trembling finger and said, "They used the law to thin us. They circled men they wanted to disappear." The medic tapped the candle. "We must keep this safe. We cannot stand in the open with these proofs and expect to survive long." His voice was low and practical. He had seen men die from exhaustion and he would not risk more. The survivor looked at the hidden scraps and felt an aftertaste of something like relief and dread braided together. They had exposed a link to the magistrate. They had forced the warden to show his hand. They had not, however, changed the ledger's route. The chapter closed in concrete action. The survivor slid a torn page into the seam beneath his blanket, and the older prisoner nailed the floorboard back into place. "Hide them here," the older prisoner said. "Hide them and pass them when you can." The survivor left the alcove with a bandaged arm and a plan burning quietly in his mind. He had forced a public reading. He had proved the ledger's chain. The warden was still in his office, the magistrate's name still stamped on folded scraps, and men still slept only when their bodies could no longer hold them upright. At dusk the warden ordered a roll call. He read names from the ledger and looked directly at the survivor once, with a face that registered something close to fear for an instant before returning to control. The survivor answered his name and stood. The warden closed the book and said, "This matter will be addressed through proper channels." The warden's mouth closed over that phrase like a lid. The survivor walked back to his pallet, slid the torn page beneath his blanket, and felt the weight of paper and the thinness of their victory. He had exposed the ledger's hidden page, forced a guard's confession, and torn the ledger before the men. He had moved through betrayal, into suspicion, into anger, and landed on a cold resolve to preserve evidence. The chapter's final beat remained concrete. A nail hammered into a floorboard, a scrap of paper hidden beneath, and the survivor tucking his shirt over the seam as if nothing had happened. That small action closed the scene and set the next choice into motion. Guards threw the survivor's body onto the cot. The warden flipped the ledger to the ordinance that forbade sleep. Betrayal rose in the survivor's chest like cold iron when the warden read the line aloud and did not look away. The infirmary smelled of boiled bandages and candle wax. The warden tapped the ledger with his thumb and ordered, "Keep him breathing." That command made the problem plain. The law itself had become the instrument of harm. The warden stood with the ledger open on his palm. He did not widen his eyes. The survivor's fingers curled around the threadbare blanket. He tasted copper on his tongue and pressed his jaw so that nothing leaked out. A guard hauled the blanket from the survivor's shoulders and set a pail of cold water by the cot. The survivor's wrists still bore rope burns from earlier restraint. The newcomers to the infirmary took a step back when the warden matched the ledger's rules to the corpse, like rhythm of the sleeping men outside. The first emotion that drove the survivor in those moments was betrayal. He had trusted that the penal code existed to keep order, not to break bodies. That belief had been eroded in 3 earlier nights. The ledger slapped shut by the warden, the yard swallowing the survivor's head as he hit stone, and the collapsed body shoved into the warden's office. Those events were fixed facts in his mind, and they guided his choices now. He did not say anything. He watched the warden's hands and counted, in his head, the number of times a man could be ordered to stand until his knees forgot purpose. A guard named Calder knelt and checked the survivor's pulse. Calder's hands trembled despite the steadiness the uniform demanded. Calder had been in the yard when the warden first read the law aloud. He had watched prisoners straighten as though someone had pulled a string. "He'll live if he keeps breathing, Calder." But he did not look at the warden when he said it. The warden replied flat, "Breathing is not the point, Calder. The ordinance is the point." He closed the ledger with a practiced motion. The sound of that closing landed in the room like a sealing lid. The warden's voice was low and rough. "We show the magistrate we follow the order. We cannot let softness spread." The magistrate's visit waited on the next beat of the watch. News of a visiting magistrate had circulated the previous day. That inspection was the bureaucratic hinge that hardened the ordinance into policy. The warden had prepared the ledger like a weapon for a parade. He had already used it twice. Once to stop men from lying down in the yard, and once to justify dragging a collapsed prisoner through his office door. Now the ledger would be used to justify transporting a man who could no longer stand. The survivor's breathing came in ragged pulls. He processed each sound as a measurement. How many breaths until a guard noticed? How many breaths until the warden ordered escalation? The second emotion shift arrived as fear, pragmatic, sharp, tied to the body's betrayals. Fear made him obey the tiny, practical rules that might keep him alive. He kept his eyes open. He forced his fingers to unclench. He did not allow his head to roll back. A narrow focus settled on his palms, on the rope burns, on the way the pail of water reflected candlelight. A guard moved to drag the blanket up around the survivor's shoulders. The warden, no more comforts. He stands when the roll call begins. He will stand when they watch. Calder's mouth tightened. "Sir." He collapsed twice already. "He needs rest." The warden's hand closed like a trap around the ledger's margin. The ordinance names the sentence. Rest is a privilege they forfeit. Calder's jaw clenched. He lowered his eyes, then reached to steady the survivor's shoulder. The survivor felt the hand, registered the touch as an act that did not belong to the warden. That small contact became a pivot. Outside, a howl of a prisoner coughing rolled down the corridor. The sound forced everyone to move. The warden pushed the ledger under his arm and walked to the doorway. Guards formed a tight line. The survivor was slung upright between 2 men and carried out. He could not hold himself, his knees folded. A fellow prisoner, Bren, stepped forward, caught his torso and kept him upright for 1 breath. The warden barked, "Back away," and Bren froze, hands still on the survivor. Bren's palms smelled of sweat and straw. Bren had been in the yard 2 nights earlier when the warden ordered the roll call demonstration. Bren had seen men poked with poles and mocked when their eyes dipped. He had been the one who later slipped a note into the survivor's hand. That scrap contained a sentence burned into the survivor's head. An account, a list of times, a bit of testimony. Bren's intervention in the infirmary was not spontaneous kindness. It was habit and risk. He did not speak. He moved his face close enough to the survivor to whisper. "Hold on." The warden leaned forward and said, "Name." The survivor's lips made the name in the dark, Thomas. The warden barked to a guard, "Put Thomas in the line." "He will stand." 2 guards hoisted him. The corridor light carved hard shadows. Men in the yard glanced up and kept standing because the ledger dictated spectacle. A public demonstration of endurance followed that night in the barracks yard. Torches burned low. The warden paced like a captain at a parade. The roll call stretched like a bar. Guards passed along with sticks, poking the shoulders of those who swayed. Voices rose and fell in short commands. Bren stayed at the survivor's side while they forced him to remain upright. The crowd watched them as a test. Could a man be broken by the policy of sleeplessness? The warden made it into an exhibition. During the display, a guard named Marlowe jutted a finger toward the survivor's temple and said, "Keep your eyes open, Thomas." The survivor's eyes twitched and defied him. He answered, "I am awake." Marlowe laughed without mirth. "We'll see." A small discovery broke the rhythm. The survivor's hand folded around a folded scrap of paper. A guard noticed the movement and reached to pry it away. The third emotion shift arrived then. Anger at exposure edged toward desperate hope. Anger made the survivor move. He shoved his elbow back. The guard, Kess, seized the paper and tugged. Bren lunged forward. "Give it back, Bren." Kess jerked the paper free and held it like contraband. The struggle over the scrap was brief and loud. The guard cursed and shoved Bren into the shoulders of another prisoner. A sharp exchange followed. "Hands off, Kess. He hides things. He hides nothing but truth." Bren answered. "Give it here, Kess." Kess flicked the paper open with one finger. He scanned a few words and his face registered something like calculation. Kess did not read silently. He read in front of everyone and then showed it to another guard. The warden moved toward them with the ledger tucked under his arm. The paper's presence risked exposing testimony the wardens had not authorized. A sudden external event changed the track of the night. A magistrate's horse hooves thundered in the lane. Someone shouted the sound into the yard. The warden straightened. "Magistrate," he said. He moved like a man who wanted to display obedience more than evidence. Guards tightened the line. The survivor's shoulders burned. He blinked and felt sleep slipping in like a traitor. He tried to push the sensation away by slapping the side of his head. His fingers trembled. The magistrate arrived in a candlelit sedan and stepped into the warden's office. He carried the neutral look of someone who had seen too many petitions. The warden placed the ledger on the desk and showed it as proof. "The ordinance is necessary." The warden. "They must be awake to labor and awake to obey." The magistrate's eyes flicked over the ledger's entries. He skimmed past orders and signatures. The office smelled of wax and boiled rope. The magistrate tapped a page with his ring and said, "The law reads severe, but the court will examine needs." "How many men have fallen?" The warden answered, "Precise. 3 this fortnight have collapsed from failure to remain awake. We recovered them. We returned them to standing. The ordinance is enforced. Order is restored." The magistrate scribbled. He did not look up at the survivor's face when the warden motioned toward the infirmary. The bureaucratic validation hardened the law's teeth. The survivor felt the shape of the ledger like a jaw closing above him. An officer from the magistrate's retinue asked, "Have any lodged complaints?" The warden tilted the ledger, only the normal murmurs. "Discipline must be maintained." The officer's pen hesitated. His expression did not change for long, but his hand lifted and the pen scratched. That motion signaled a slow transfer of responsibility from individual actors to a written record. The survivor watched the magistrate's hand and realized the law no longer needed a single cruel face. It could function through signatures and margins. Late that night, the survivor's body betrayed him. He blinked into a microsleep while standing in the line. A guard, Marlowe, saw his lids dip and shouted, "He's down!" The warden turned and ordered, "Drag him upright." The guard yanked at the survivor's arms. He jolted back awake. His head snapped. Pain seared his temples. The roll call stuttered. Bren shoved forward and caught him before he fell. "Let him be." Bren snarled. "He cannot stand on his feet." 3 guards moved to separate Bren. One slapped Bren's wrists. The survivor tasted grit in his mouth and heard Bren's voice strain. "Step back, warden. He cannot stand and you will kill him." The warden's reply came like a blade. "Do you defy the ordinance, Bren?" The yard stilled. Prisoners turned their faces. Some looked away. The warden raised his baton. The confrontation that followed was the chapter's climax. The warden drove the ledger's authority into the yard and made the choice. Escalation or mercy? He chose escalation. Take him up, he said to the guards, to isolation. He will learn. The guards bound the survivor's arms. Bren moved to resist. You will leave him. Then Bren shouted, you will let him rot alone. A rapid exchange snapped between the warden, Bren, and the guards. Step back. The warden ordered, not until you unhand him. Bren answered, you will not drag him until I say so. Bren again, hands off, a guard said. We do what the ledger says. The warden, you have a choice. Warden, Bren, not one you can claim now. The volley counted 6 back, and 4th lines. Each line shortened the air into a narrow decision. The warden's baton rose. He moved with authority that had been drilled into his shoulders. The guards closed ranks. Bren's face was set. Back away, the warden snapped, and a guard shoved Bren aside. Bren made a small, calculated motion. He slipped a folded scrap into his sleeve and let his hands go limp. The survivor's chest heaved. A guard grabbed his collar and dragged him toward the narrow corridor of isolation. The physical shoving, the clang of metal, the scrape of boots against stone were immediate events. The survivor was forced along the threshold with a single guttering torch lighting the scene. He could not step off the path himself. Soldiers' grips bit into his shoulders. Bren managed with his free hand to whisper, the paper, keep it safe. The words were a promise that a fragment of testimony would outlive the enforcement of the ordinance. In the narrow isolation cell corridor, the warden closed the ledger with a small, controlled motion that revealed satisfaction rather than cruelty. He did not look like a monstrous man in the moment of victory. He looked like an administrator completing a task. The survivor hammered on the door once, twice, until his hands ached. Guards dragged him inside. The door shut, the torchlight outside guttered. The corridor resumed the measured footsteps of men who had a job to perform. The survivor was left alone on a thin pallet. He could not find sleep even if the ordinance had not forbidden it. His body had learned vigilance born of fear. The warden returned to his office and set the ledger on the desk. He called Calder in and said, record his restraint. Make note of his collapse. Calder nodded and moved to write. The warden watched Calder mark the line and sign it. The signature acted like a seal that smoothed the ledger's violence into administrative fact. The next morning, a file docket in the archive received routine processing. The fellow prisoner, Bren, had slipped a small page into his sleeve earlier and had later placed the scrap in the margins of a dismissed docket he had access to while performing menial sorting. The scrap contained a short testimony, names, times, a line describing the law's implementation, and a plea. Preserve this account. A clerk, half asleep and unfamiliar with the details, filed the dismissed docket with a careless hand. The page survived by its tucked placement and the clerk's disinterest. Later, months after the warden celebrated the ledger's effectiveness, a magistrate's clerk opened the dismissed docket for a routine review. The clerk's finger slid a note free and read the hand-scrawled line. They keep us awake until we break. Record this. Thomas, he frowned. He read it again and clipped it to the margin of the official docket. The clerk's action did not make a headline. It made a record. That single motion guaranteed the survivor's voice a fragile afterlife. When news of the smuggled page reached the survivor, it reached him indirectly through rumors in the yard and the careful actions of Bren. He did not leap into triumph. He felt something less tidy, a tenuous relief threaded with fear. The ledger remained in the warden's chest. The ordinance remained law. The survivor's immediate fate did not change overnight. But the knowledge that someone had recorded his failure to stand altered the moral geometry of the barracks. Men lit the faint possibility that an account existed beyond the warden's ledger. Sometime after, in a different room lit by slow candlelight, a magistrate read the margin and frowned again. He ordered an inquiry. The warden bristled. He defended the ordinance as necessary. He produced the ledger and showed the magistrate signed notes and daily logs. The magistrate examined the ledger alongside the smuggled scrap. The two documents no longer told precisely the same story. Paper contradicted ledger. The magistrate's hand hovered over the ledgers and the margins, Bren faced a consequence for his intervention. Guards hauled him before the warden and searched his person. They found nothing but a smudge of ink on his sleeve. The warden accused him of insubordination and placed him under close watch. Bren accepted the punishment with a face that registered a slow, defiant calculation rather than panic. He had taken the risk because he had recognized that the ledger did not tell the full truth. His action had shifted the balance from private suffering to public trace. The survivor's recovery was slow and uneven. He slept in fits, never for long. He learned to break the roll calls into shorter counts and to press his weight into his calves to stop them from folding. He watched faces. He catalogued guard rotations. He learned that small resistances, a timed blink, a planted weight, bought minutes of unconsciousness without exposing a paper. He traded small favors with Calder and with Marlowe in exchange for water or a pail closer to his cot. Those trades were survival, not solidarity. The conflict's public face changed when the magistrate summoned the warden to defend the ordinance. The warden argued in measured tones that labor required wakefulness. The magistrate offered a practical question. Did the policy produce greater labor or simply remove men from the workforce by breaking them? The warden cited the ledger's entries. The magistrate cited the margin note. The exchange intensified the warden's anger because his authority now required justification beyond display. A twist emerged that changed how the survivor and the listeners understood an earlier event. The warden had insisted in private that the collapsed body pushed across his office floor had been unconscious from drunkenness, not deprivation. That claim had been accepted in silence by some guards. The smuggled page, however, contained a time-stamped account that matched the ledger's own entry times and described the guard's physical acts during the collapse. The testimony revealed that the guard who had shoved the man had been ordered by the warden to keep him upright. The discovery showed the warden had used his discretion to escalate punishment, not merely maintain order. That specific motive was the twist. The law had supplied cover for a warden's will. In a heated hearing, voices rose for a short exchange. "You pushed him." Calder blurted, "I did as I was told." Marlowe answered, "You let him lie." The magistrate said, "No. He collapsed and was revived," the warden replied. The back and forth lasted 4 lines and then stalled as the magistrate demanded written evidence. The ledger fell under a microscope. Signatures and times became contested facts. In the yard, the prisoners watched those proceedings with guarded attention. Men guessed at the outcome. The survivor listened to the cadence of the warden's footsteps outside the isolation door. He waited for the next order, a punishment or a reprieve. For a moment the wardens looked like ordinary men, nervous under questioning. The survivor's reaction was careful. His breathing measured, his jaw tight, his fingers mapping the pattern of the straw pallet. He did not celebrate. He conserved strength. When the magistrate returned a verdict softer than some expected, it still changed the warden's posture. The magistrate ordered modifications. Fewer consecutive hours standing, a slow rotation of watchmen, and a review of severe enforcement. The warden complied in form but not in full spirit. He adjusted the ledger entries and instructed guards to be more discreet. He never acknowledged guilt. The legal adjustment offered partial restraint to the ledger's worst applications, but not the end of suffering. The final concrete beat of the chapter unfolded in the archive. The dismissed docket that carried the survivor a scrap of testimony remained misfiled but accessible. Years hence, when another clerk catalogued the records and paused over the smudged margin, he placed the scrap between official pages and wrote a single line of note. That act sealed the smuggled page into the bureaucratic machine, where it could be summoned by a future inquiry. The survivor never watched that clerk write the note, but the act determined his story's afterlife. The survivor left the isolation cell on a morning that smelled of cold porridge and rope-torn blankets. Bren met him near the yard gate and handed him back the folded scrap, now smooth by handling. "You kept breathing, Thomas Bren. You kept enough to be recorded." Thomas took the paper and folded it into the inner sleeve of his tunic. He did not smile. He placed his fingers on the words and felt the indentations as proof that someone had noticed his collapse. The ledger still closed on the warden's desk. The ordinance still had teeth. The record, though, breathed in a different direction. The chapter closed on a single situational movement. The warden stood in his office and tapped the ledger's cover. He could not see the smuggled margin in the archive. He felt victorious because the yard now displayed obedience when he walked by. He did not hear the clerk's notation. In the yard, the survivor walked between men and counted, in his head, the seconds until roll call. He felt a measure of distance from fear, not freedom. Bren watched the warden move away and then turned his palm inside out to hide the smudged ink. The final line of the chapter is the clerk sliding the dismissed docket back onto the shelf while the survivor below continues to carry his folded testimony inside his tunic. A thin, tangible promise that an official record had outlived the warden's immediate triumph.